Hello, welcome to the ESPC Property Show. It's Paul, and as ever, it's
Megan.
So it is.
Yeah, we're back with part 2 of our roundtable episode with 3 of our solicitor estate agent member firms. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, you can go back and watch that. That's a property market review from the previous 6 months and a bit of a forecast for the next 6 months. But this episode is more of a macro look at the political side of the housing market.
It certainly is something a bit different. And actually, we recorded this episode just before. We think maybe hours before the announcement of the general election. But the team discussed a lot of things on this show, including rent caps, taxation, and what they would do if they were in government. Heaven help us. But I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. So without further ado, here's the app. I want to talk about rent caps. Matt, you touched upon it, that we've seen landlords come to market to sell the properties. Almost felt like it was one bit of legislation too many for many landlords. What's your take on rent caps? Has it worked? Has it worked against the market? Any thoughts?
Well, I think invariably a lot of these initiatives are made with the best intentions, but the reality of the impact in the market has been detrimental to, I think tenants in the main. Because ultimately it has driven landlords to sell properties. They've decided that they've had enough of the private rental sector, and so they're moving properties on. And we've seen a big influx of property, as I said before, coming onto the market from landlords who are just thinking, enough's enough. Interest rates have gone up. We can't put the rent up in tandem with the interest rates. The cost of maintaining the property is prohibitive for them. So they've had no alternative but to sell. And it puts a real pressure on the diversification of ultimately pensions and retirement. So that's an area of real concern. Yeah. We've also found that there's evidence of landlords who have looked to evict tenants that have been long-standing tenants because they've had no alternative but to do that, and then put the property back onto the market for a higher rent, which has been quite an interesting scenario. So there's dangers in that regard, and of course ultimately the tenant has suffered.
That's it. It's almost like it hasn't served anyone. I mean, we've seen a reduction of around 20% in our lettings portfolio. Yeah. And, even this year, you've got students coming in February looking for a property, and, for the start of the new university term, you think something's not right here.
Yeah.
Amy?
I mean, I think the problem with rent caps, and I think the problem with a lot of the policies around the private rental sector are that they tar all landlords with the same brush, and that's that landlords are bad. And I think what they've looked to do is benefit poorer people at the lower end of the rental market. They've looked to curtail greedy landlords with huge portfolios at the higher end of the market, and what they've completely missed is the vast majority in the middle of decent, honourable landlords providing very good and much needed homes. For a healthy property market overall, we need all sectors of property to be flourishing, and the private rental sector is on its knees with rent caps, with legislation, with controls, with the additional dwelling supplement tax. Huge shortage of property, and therefore, high rents, or people feeling unable to move because they've got low rents, even though that perhaps their family requirements mean they need to move. It's a mess.
Yeah, and in many cases, there's a great relationship between the landlord and the
Absolutely.
tenant. These are the most important relationships.
Yeah, I think it's in everyone's interest, isn't it? For a landlord and tenant to get on it. And I think the irony of all this is the bad landlords, as you refer to, legislation ain't going to touch them because it's all on the ground. It's not going to be done through an official channel. You're not going to use a letting agent. It's going to be cash in hand, or it's going to be some other way of working. No one's going to see that. Yeah. Derek, have you any thoughts on this?
We saw a lot of this last year. I mean, I think kind of surprisingly, January 2023 picked up really well, given the mini-budget fiasco 3-4 months before, to everyone's surprise. And the early part of the year was very, very good. We noticed a definite trend middle of the year. Yeah. There was a lot of your kind of traditional 2-bed tenement flats, 2-bed and box, coming on Newington, Marchmont, Bruntsfield, Morningside, your traditional student areas. So it was a case of, you know, first-time buyer stuff, form an orderly queue. Good quality family homes with a garden, form an orderly queue. 2-bed flats, take your pick.
But when they did sell, I guess they didn't necessarily go to landlords, they went to the private market.
A lot of private buyers, I think. You know, folk were just coming to us and saying, this just isn't washing its face anymore.
Yeah, I mean,
you know,
I think...
We're coming to the end of a 5-year fixed rate, we're paying an extra... I can't remember, one guy I spoke to in Bruntsfield, his mortgage was going up from 300 and something to over 1,000 a month. Now, goodness knows what rate he had previously, or goodness knows what rate he was going to. But that's just not sustainable. And they're not encouraged to buy them, you know. With ADS and the whole thing, it's just not an attractive proposition. Exactly.
No. I think a lot of the first-time buyers that we've seen, you know, we were saying that there's been very healthy volume of first-time buyers. A lot of them would be people who would rent. But actually it's been cheaper for them to find a deposit, you know, through whatever means possible and to get on the property ladder. And there's been 100% renter's mortgage available. There's much better loan to value mortgages available now than there were a few years ago as well. And that's, you know, I guess taken people into that sector away from private rentals.
Yeah, and we spoke, sorry Matt, we spoke about the money being redirected in the money cycle as well, about them going into property funds as opposed to being a direct landlord.
Yeah, absolutely. There's landlords selling their private rented properties to take their money out of that, to put their money into a property fund, a fund that's probably not even in Scotland, that will not then provide the kind of accommodation that we think we want in our private rental sector. And it's again, not providing homes for people. And I think the other thing that I would say about the private rental sector is that we need a healthy private rental sector because people want to live transiently. There needs to be nuance and flexibility and choice in the way that people live, where they live, how they choose to live, who they choose to live with. Rentals provide that in a way that owner-occupied properties don't sometimes.
There's also a fundamental responsibility of landlords to maintain the property stock and look after it. And if they find that they simply can't afford to do that because there's a rent cap or whatever that might be, with interest rates going slightly higher as well, the actual maintenance of improving the accommodation for the tenant disappears. Putting double glazing in, upgrading kitchens, bathrooms, all of those refurbishment projects are just put on hold.
So I think you make a really good point there because, as you say, there's a lot of landlords who actually want to look after the tenants. You know, we've got 100%. Stuff just now where folk are coming to us saying we're kind of having to sell. It's just, you know, we can't afford it anymore. We've had a really good tenant in. We want to look after them. We want to make it as easy as possible for them to move on and find something else. We want to minimise hassle to them. We want to look after them. And you're right, you know, it's all the kind of rogue landlords, if I can use the term, that are the ones that are laughing up their sleeves, and it's the good guys that are
it goes underground because quite often the tenants have nowhere to go.
Exactly.
So,
and it's a fear.
That's the danger.
It's a fear. And there's me think we weren't going to get any solid answers on that one.
Could all be completely wrong, of course.
So on the podcast, we always like to chat about first-time buyers, and as we kind of mentioned about talking about first-time buyers finding funds, that remains to be a bit of a challenge. So what initiatives would you guys like to see for first-time buyers, and should there be any?
I think first-time buyers in Scotland are unfairly penalised compared to the rest of the UK by the much lower threshold for land and buildings transaction tax. They start paying land and buildings transaction tax at £175,000, and with Edinburgh, that really doesn't get you much property at all. You know, Derek was referring to first-time buyers looking around the £400,000 mark, and actually, if you compare Edinburgh to London, for example, that's quite a reasonable. You know,
you're still not paying stamp duty tax at 400
stamp duty
in
there.
England
It's
if you're a first-time buyer.
that it kicks in at. So you know, we're unfair on first-time buyers here for a start. So I think the very first thing that can be done is a reduction to land and buildings transaction tax for first-time buyers. That extra few £1,000s that helps them get a better mortgage rate, get a better deposit, get some furniture once they've moved in. You know, all of those things help. And then I think what we need is things like the First Home Fund to come back. All of those schemes are always swallowed up as soon as they're available. And you know, I think the government really need to look to how they can fund that better, how they can fund that more sustainably, whether they can fund some of that with private investment as well. All of these things that I think would be worth investigating further. Not suggesting I've got all of the answers on this one. I think, you know, that you don't want to look like some greedy capitalist. I think we recognise that there's areas of the market, looking at property as a whole, in the social housing space, all of these areas that can be massively improved with getting heads together, with thinking about how all of these things join up and how they're all connected. You know, my solution would be to create some sort of investor mortgage where those landlords who are perhaps already renting back to local authorities are encouraged to invest further into that to improve the quality of housing stock in that social space, as well as saving for their own pension and retirement fund. And I think there's lots of things around that can be fed into the first-time buyer space as well, that helps more people become first-time buyers. I think for many people, £175,000 is far too far out of reach, never mind 400,000.
And it's important that we maintain a broad section of the population within the city itself. And, you know, we do have first-time buyers in the city, living in the city, working in the city, because the cost of travel and the cost of living in the outskirts or jumping on buses and going into some of the other towns in the outskirts is prohibitive for them. So why not encourage them to live in the city centre and keep the city vibrant, which is really what we want to be doing.
And I think in filling, you know, if we can't no longer occupy these properties with offices or shops, let's get creative about how we have them as accommodation. Derek, what are your thoughts?
I think all of the above, basically. There needs to be some kind of joined up thinking. Maybe that will happen now. Don't want to be too political, but we know that there's been a few events that have occurred in the last couple of weeks. I just think that it needn't be rocket science. You know, on the one hand, the Scottish Government are saying we're crying out for rental stock. On the other hand, they're saying to landlords, but we'll charge you an extra 6% if you want to buy one. It's not difficult, you know.
So you do something on the additional dwelling tax?
So, without doubt. You know, I mean, we're penalising folk who are trying to kind of invest. And as I say, there's a lot of good people out there, a lot of good landlords out there.
I agree that additional dwelling supplement should be a thing. There should be some advantage given to people who only have one property compared to those who can afford to have more. But I think having it at 6% is stifling.
And certainly I think we cover a broad area. So if you go to the borders in the southwest, where you're very close to the English border and you can make a choice about which side of that you buy a property. With these taxes, you're probably going on the other side of the border, and you know, yes, you could argue, well, this isn't a big amount of property, but it's big for those areas, it's big for those towns, and it's big for the income that comes in from these things.
Well, that's it. I mean, this is what I'm saying. You know, it's incumbent upon us to retain the population.
Of course it is.
Within the cities and the towns, and so that we can encourage them to spend money in the shops and the restaurants and keep the general standard of living going for everybody.
Absolutely.
And we don't want to diminish the population because we're driving them out because if they can't afford to.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And we have you know, buy-to-let events here where we invite potential first-time investors to come and chat about it. And the amount of people who are completely shocked that they have to pay this 6%, they didn't even realise that was a thing, and it completely puts them off doing it.
It's a barrier,
that's what we've noticed as well.
I think it means that when you invest in property, say around the £250,000 mark, you really need to be hanging on to that property for a decade for it to be a solid investment, you know, and that's, again, not getting you a huge amount of property in the Edinburgh market, in those kind of rentable areas, your Marchmont, etc., where you're going to appeal to that student rental market. I think it's a really tricky one.
And I think that rate has driven some landlords to look for lower price property. and then that means you're competing again against first-time buyers for it, which is the very opposite of what the ADS was designed to do. You know, so it's the unintended consequences.
Last year, the year before, probably post-COVID, a lot of folk were kind of coming out of the larger, you know, kind of 4 or 5 bedroom flats in Marchmont and saying, right, we'll buy 3 one-bed flats instead. You know.
Okay, we may have covered this, but I'll ask you anyway. How would you go about solving the recently announced housing crisis? Anything that we haven't covered that you'd want to build more property, I guess?
Yeah, build more property, encourage, as you were saying, the conversion of non-residential property to residential use, and I think within city centre spaces that's particularly important. Looking at the quality of the housing that they're building across all sectors of the property market. I mean, you know, if we could...
Cladding.
don't get me started on cladding. Yeah, but again, that feeds into the quality of the housing stock that they're building and the future sustainability of that housing stock as well. You look at a lot of the local authority housing that was built in the 1970s, 1980s, and it's not stood the test of time. It's not, you know, it's not... It's got ventilation problems, or it's got all sorts of other issues that I think that really needs to be done properly. And whether we look at how private investment can impact that and what can be done to improve that generally, or whether it all has to be government investment, I don't know. But
I mean, I think, you know, interesting to see, this crisis hasn't happened overnight. We've been foretelling this for years, haven't we? We've been building towards this, and or not building, as the case may be. And I think you know, we've called it a crisis now. 500,000 homes that were bought, that were ex-council, those weren't really replaced. So that right to buy thing in the 80s,
right to buy thing in the 80s,
that was the seeds of it. You know, the very seeds of this begins, and here we are. Interesting enough, I mean, we were at Parliament today and we were talking, and one of the things that we were debating is, should it just be a single issue now that we focus? You know, I'm not quite sure what it means when you call it a housing crisis. What's going to change today that wasn't there tomorrow? You know, what are we doing differently now? And there was a debate around, should we get everyone absolutely focused on it, all parties, everyone committed to it, bringing in private money, bringing in all the stakeholders and getting together and going, guys, we've got a crisis here, we need to fix it. And ensuring that the housing minister is on the cabinet. Unbelievable.
That I think is absolutely vital, that the Scottish Housing Minister should be a cabinet position. And it's
certainly for as long as they claim that there's a housing crisis, which
I mean, absolutely.
It needs kind of, you know, proper
we need a real focus
proper
on
discussion.
Correct.
You know.
Quality of life is important for everybody, and everybody's got an absolute right to live in a decent and safe environment, particularly with families, etc. Again, you know, for first-time buyers, maybe it's a sort of try before you buy scenario, whereby you know, for young first-time buyers can rent properties and then it converts to a purchase. To a purchase.
European models are like that.
And you know, these are the initiatives and the creative thinking that I think all parties need to consider. We do need an all-party focus on this, and I also think it's important that all parties listen to property professionals. You're obviously there today, Paul.
Yeah.
So
they'll all be listening to this podcast.
And I think people lose sight of property being a home. You know, a lot of people get very hung up on, it must be an investment and I must be able to make money on it and all of these things. And actually, if you're paying off the capital and interest on your mortgage, you're saving money rather than lining a landlord's pockets. You know, so anything that gets buyers to that stage, because I think ultimately if we solve the housing crisis, then we probably need to look at demand not outstripping supply, and within the property market, the thing that increases the value of a property is the demand continuing to outstrip supply. But it's about looking at property as home being a vital place to live for everybody's welfare and well-being, and therefore their contribution to society as a whole, and that what they're doing to pay for that home is saving for their own future, you know, without that necessarily meaning that the saving is coming from the increase in value of the property.
And I think, you know, whilst contrary to popular belief, none of us want to see ever increasing spiralling house values, because we know in the end it has to come to an end. Wages don't keep up, and then what happens, and we know potentially what happens, though it's never really happened in Edinburgh, we're not seeing that recorrection, but it's not great for the market. You know, I think we just want slow and steady growth, and we want a fully functioning market, I think.
So what drove a lot of this was obviously the Bank of England increasing the interest rate in response to Liz Truss's mini budget. We have made predictions at the start of this year as to when they were going to come down. Paul's prediction was incorrect, but when do you guys think we're going to see the first cut?
I thought May as well. There we go. Yeah. May, June? I mean, I don't know.
I think July, August, and it depends upon inflation continuing to track down the way. Yeah, and I think, I think certainly late summer would be my prediction for it at this stage. I had very much hoped it would have been the last one. But yeah, I think inflation continues on a downward trajectory later this summer. Seems reasonable.
Yeah, so MPC I think meets late June, so that could be the first. Yeah. The vote's getting closer.
Well,
that's the thing.
2 in favour, 7 against. We're getting closer.
There'll be some kind of tweak.
There'll be political pressure as well because of elections and various things like that. It's, but some of the products, the mortgage products have fluctuated. They've gone up and they've come down. Yeah, they're trying to read the market. And normally they get it right, but we've seen increases recently, and more recently this week actually I've noticed that there's a few building societies that are actually reducing mortgage rates. So that might be the start of the sort of the general trend. We just have to keep an eye on it. But I think I agree with the guys. I mean, it's going to happen sooner rather than later. Probably July is about right, I think. Thanks, guys. That was really good. Really appreciate you taking time. And I think everyone listening will certainly get something out of today's show. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Good.
Thanks, guys.
So that was the end of part 2 of our roundtable with our member firms. We hope you enjoyed that. We will be back next week with our last episode of the series, and it's a clue. We are recording it today in the lovely town of St Andrews, so you can come back next week to hear all about the property market there.
Indeed, yeah. So hopefully you enjoyed today. As I say, we thought that was really interesting, some really good debate and some really well thought out ideas at all about what can help the market. So thanks for listening, and we will catch you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.